The evening air was calm, the kind that carried the faint sound of distant traffic and the soft hum of city lights. On a quiet street corner, two patrol officers sat in their cruiser chatting softly to pass the time. Their shift had been uneventful so far, just a few routine stops, nothing serious. It was the kind of night that made officers grateful for peace, even if it came with a touch of boredom. One of them noticed a small silver car pull into the parking lot of a nearby convenience store. It stopped oddly, half over the line, engine still running. The driver stepped out, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. The officers didn't think much of it at first, but something about the man's body language caught their attention. He wasn't in a hurry, but he looked uneasy, distracted. The man walked into the store, a small local shop that stayed open late. The officers could see him through the glass windows, moving between the aisles, picking up a few things, some bottled water, a snack, and what looked like a pack of batteries. He walked up to the counter, spoke briefly to the clerk, then seemed to fumble for something in his pocket. After a moment, he turned and walked back toward the door. The clerk suddenly called out, his voice sharp and upset. "Hey, you didn't pay for that." The man froze, his hand still on the door handle. He turned slightly, confusion flashing across his face. The clerk was already coming around the counter, waving his hands. "You took that stuff and didn't pay," he yelled again. By now, the officers had stepped out of their cruiser, heading toward the store. One of them radioed in, reporting a possible theft in progress. Inside, the man tried to explain, but his words were drowned out by the clerk's frustration. The officers entered, calm but alert. "Sir, please step aside," one of them said firmly. The man turned to them, his voice low and controlled. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was going to pay. My card..." "Sir," the officer interrupted, keeping his tone professional. "We just need to sort this out. Please show us some ID." The man hesitated. His hand went to his jacket pocket, but it trembled slightly. The younger officer noticed. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep the situation calm. The man sighed. "I'm a police captain," he said quietly. "I can explain everything." That sentence changed the air in the room. The officers exchanged a quick glance. One raised his brow slightly but kept his expression neutral. "Do you have identification to confirm that?" the older officer asked. The man nodded and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a badge gleaming under the store lights. For a brief second, silence filled the space. Then the clerk spoke up again. "I don't care who he is," the clerk said angrily. "He walked out with the stuff." The officers had no choice but to follow procedure. The badge didn't make the situation go away, it just made it heavier. They couldn't treat him differently, not if they wanted to do their job right. "Sir," the senior officer said carefully, "you understand we have to verify the situation. We'll need you to step outside for a moment." The captain's jaw tightened. He looked embarrassed, frustrated even. He glanced around the store. Two customers had taken out their phones and started recording. His own reflection stared back from the window, and for the first time in his long career, he saw himself not as a protector of order, but as someone being watched, judged outside. The parking lot lights buzzed faintly. The night air felt colder now. The captain stood beside his car while one officer radioed for confirmation about his identity. The other stayed near him, calm but cautious. "I told you," the man said quietly. "I was going to pay. The card reader wasn't working. I stepped out to get cash for my car. That's all." "I understand, sir," the younger officer said, not unkindly. "But we have to follow protocol." "You know that." The captain gave a weary nod. "Yes, I trained officers for this exact thing." Minutes passed like hours. The clerk had followed them out, still muttering about thieves and unpaid goods. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by curiosity. The glow of phone cameras added to the tension. When the verification came through, confirming that the man was indeed a police captain, there was another layer of discomfort. The officers had to decide what came next. The clerk insisted on pressing charges, claiming theft. According to policy, they couldn't ignore a complainant. "I'm sorry, sir," the older officer said, his tone heavy with regret. "We'll need to take you in until this is cleared." The captain closed his eyes for a moment. It was a short silence, but it felt endless. Then he gave a slow nod. "Do what you have to do." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed in the quiet parking lot. The crowd gasped, some whispering. A man who had spent his life upholding the law was now standing in its grip. The irony was painful. As they led him to the patrol car, flashes from phones followed him. The captain didn't resist. He just walked slowly, each step heavy with disbelief. Inside the cruiser, he stared straight ahead, his mind racing through the events of the past half hour. He knew how quickly stories like this spread, how they twisted before the truth ever had a chance to catch up. At the station, the desk sergeant looked up in shock when he saw who was being brought in. "Captain?" he whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make it real. The younger officer handed over the report, avoiding eye contact. "Possible shoplifting. Pending investigation," he said softly. The captain sat on a bench in the holding area, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He looked around, taking in the sterile walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, the faint smell of coffee and disinfectant. It was a place he knew better than most, but tonight it felt foreign. He thought about the irony of it all. He'd lectured recruits about fairness, about how justice should never favor anyone. Now he was the living proof of those words, yet the sting of humiliation burned deeper than he could admit. He wondered what his officers would think, how his family would react when they heard the news. A detective approached him quietly. "Captain," he said, lowering his voice, "we're verifying everything. Just sit tight. It might take some time." The captain nodded without looking up. "I'm not going anywhere." Hours passed. His badge and personal items were logged as evidence. The paperwork was slow, meticulous. Every step followed procedure. The officers handling him were respectful but distant, as though unsure how to act around someone who once gave them orders. In another room, the store clerk gave his statement, still certain he had caught a thief. The footage was pulled for review, but at first glance it seemed to show exactly what the clerk described, a man picking up items and walking out. No one had yet checked the few seconds after that, where he turned back toward the door empty-handed, realizing the card machine hadn't processed his payment. Back in the holding area, the captain sat in silence. He could hear the faint murmur of officers talking in the hallway, their words blending into one another. The weight of the cuffs pressed into his wrists, not from force but from what they represented. He wasn't angry with the officers. They'd done what they were supposed to do. That was the part that made it harder, knowing they were right to follow the book even if the situation was wrong. When the shift changed, a new officer came by to check on him. "You need anything? Water, maybe?" The captain looked up and gave a small smile. "No, I'm fine. Just wish I could fast forward a few hours." The officer nodded awkwardly and stepped away. Near dawn, the investigation was still ongoing. The city outside began to wake up, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding inside the precinct. News traveled fast within the force, rumors, half-truths, assumptions. Some officers defended him. Others whispered doubts. The captain closed his eyes, resting his head against the wall behind him. He'd always believed justice was blind, that truth would eventually surface. But tonight, for the first time, he felt what it was like to be on the other side of that belief, to feel powerless, waiting for fairness to find its way back. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped the two young officers wouldn't be blamed. They'd done their duty exactly as they'd been trained. If there was a mistake, it wasn't theirs. It was something bigger, something about how fragile justice could be when humans were caught between its lines. As the first light of morning crept through the window, the captain sat quietly, still in uniform from a life that suddenly felt very far away. The city outside was moving again, unaware that one of its own was waiting in silence, caught in a mistake that would soon become a story much larger than himself. The morning sun had already risen when the captain was finally allowed to make a phone call. His voice was calm, but his hands shook slightly as he held the receiver. He called his wife first, but the words caught in his throat when she answered. He didn't want to scare her, yet he couldn't hide the truth. She didn't speak for a few seconds after hearing what had happened, as if her mind refused to accept it. Then she whispered softly, "They arrested you." "Why, what did you do?" He swallowed hard and said, "It's not what it looks like." There was a mistake. When he hung up, a heavy silence filled the small room again. He looked around the station that used to feel like a second home. The walls were the same, the desks, the smell of coffee. All of it familiar, yet now he sat on the wrong side of it. Every sound echoed louder than usual. The clicking of keyboards, the ringing phones, the quiet whispers from officers walking past. Some avoided looking at him. Others gave short glances filled with confusion or pity. The two officers who had arrested him stood nearby, talking softly. They looked uncomfortable, as if unsure what to do next. The younger one finally walked over. "Sir, we're really sorry this happened," he said quietly. "We didn't know at the time." The captain nodded slowly. "You did your job," he replied. "Don't ever apologize for that." There was a strange kindness in his voice. It made the young officer look even more uneasy. He had expected anger or blame, not understanding. The captain's calmness only made the whole thing feel heavier. A short while later, a detective from Internal Affairs arrived. He greeted the captain politely but with a professional distance. "We're reviewing everything," he said. "The store footage, witness statements, transaction logs. It might take a few days." The captain simply nodded again. "I understand." When they moved him to a small private office to wait, the detective placed a cup of water in front of him. The captain didn't touch it. He just stared out the window, watching the sunlight move across the floor. He thought about the years he had spent protecting others, about the long nights on patrol, the hard decisions, the moments when people's trust meant everything. He had always believed in fairness, in doing the right thing. But sitting there, accused of something he didn't do, he felt the sting of how fragile justice could be. By the afternoon, word had spread beyond the station. News outlets were already running short online clips. The videos recorded by bystanders had surfaced, showing the arrest from shaky phone cameras. Headlines used words like shocking, disgraced, and caught stealing. They didn't mention the part where he had tried to explain, or the reason behind the confusion. The story was already out of his hands, and once it hit the public, truth had to fight to be heard. When his wife came to see him later that day, she looked tired and frightened. Her eyes searched his face, looking for answers he didn't have. "I saw the video," she said softly. "People are already talking. Our neighbors, your colleagues. It's everywhere." He looked down. "I know. I wish I could stop it." She sat across from him, her voice trembling. "You didn't do this, right?" He met her eyes. "I didn't." She took a deep breath and nodded. "Then we'll get through this." Her faith in him was steady, but he could see the hurt behind it. The kind of hurt that comes when trust collides with fear. That evening, he was released on temporary leave while the investigation continued. He walked out of the station with his personal items in a small envelope, his badge, his phone, his watch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and purple streaks. For the first time in years, he didn't drive home in a patrol car. He rode quietly in the passenger seat of his wife's car, staring out the window. The city looked different, colder somehow. At home, the silence was thick. He sat in the living room, still in his uniform, staring at nothing. His wife made him tea, but he barely touched it. Every now and then, his phone buzzed with messages. Some were from old friends offering support. Others were from journalists asking for statements. He ignored them all. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the moment again and again. The store, the clerk shouting, the officers moving in, the feel of the handcuffs. It wasn't anger that kept him awake. It was disbelief. How quickly a lifetime of service could be overshadowed by one misunderstanding. The next morning, reporters were waiting outside his home. Cameras flashed as soon as he opened the door. He shielded his eyes and said nothing, walking past them silently. Questions flew toward him. "Do you admit it? Did you steal it? Are you stepping down?" But he kept walking. His silence only fed the speculation. Inside the police department, the mood was tense. Officers whispered about the case in the hallways. Some defended him, saying it had to be a mistake. Others wondered if maybe the stress of the job had gotten to him. The chief called a private meeting, reminding everyone to stay professional and not discuss the case publicly. Still, rumors found their way into conversations, into online forums, into every corner of the city. The young officer who had arrested him couldn't sleep either. He watched the videos online, reading comments from strangers who called the captain corrupt, a disgrace. It bothered him more than he expected. He thought about the look on the captain's face that night, not fear but sadness. He knew something wasn't right. At the same time, the detective from Internal Affairs kept digging into the evidence. The store clerk insisted the captain walked out without paying. But when the detective reviewed the first part of the footage again, he noticed something strange. The card reader had flickered, freezing for a moment as the captain tried to swipe his card. The screen went blank for 2 seconds, then reset. The captain had looked at it, puzzled, before heading toward the door. The moment he stepped outside, the clerk turned to another customer, not realizing the payment hadn't gone through. The detective leaned closer to the screen. It was possible the captain had truly believed the payment was successful. The footage wasn't clear enough to prove intent either way, but it raised a doubt. A big one. He ordered the store's payment logs to be reviewed. Hours later, the transaction records showed an incomplete payment attempt at the same time the captain was at the counter. The machine had indeed failed. Still, the situation wasn't simple. The story had already gone public, and once public opinion formed, it didn't change easily. Even with evidence starting to lean in his favor, the damage had been done. The captain's reputation was on the line, and the department was under pressure from the media to show they were impartial. At home, the captain spent his days quietly, avoiding the news. He took long walks in the early morning, keeping his head down to avoid attention. Sometimes people recognized him and whispered. Some gave him sympathetic looks. Others crossed the street. He missed his work more than he expected. The routine, the sense of purpose, the respect, it had all been stripped away in an instant. But more than that, he missed trust. He missed being seen as someone who served others. One evening, the younger officer showed up at his doorstep, holding a small brown envelope. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, "but I wanted to give you this." Inside was a printed still frame from the new footage. Clearer, closer. It showed the card reader's screen frozen mid-payment. "They're reviewing this now," the officer said. "I thought you should know." The captain looked at the photo for a long time, his eyes wet but steady. "Thank you," he said softly. "You did the right thing that night." "I mean that," the young officer shook his head. "I'm not sure what the right thing even means anymore." The captain sighed. "It means doing your duty even when it hurts. You did that. And now it's my turn to wait for the truth to do its job." That night, for the first time since the arrest, he slept a little. Not peacefully, but with a small sense of hope. Hope that truth would surface even if it came slowly. A few days later, the detective returned to his office with the full report. The evidence now painted a different picture. The failed card reader, the incomplete payment record, the captain's immediate attempt to return, all of it pointed to a misunderstanding. But clearing his name officially would take more steps. Paperwork, hearings, explanations, and maybe even a public apology. For now, the detective closed the file gently and whispered to himself, "Sometimes justice stumbles before it stands tall again." Back at home, the captain sat by the window watching the city lights flicker. Somewhere inside him, beneath the exhaustion, the fear and the hurt, a quiet strength began to rise again. He didn't know how long it would take, but he believed the truth would find its way through the noise because it always had, even when the world refused to listen at first. Days turned into a quiet blur. The captain stayed home most of the time, waiting for the department's decision. The investigation was still active, but he already knew the process by heart. Slow, careful, and sometimes unfairly cold. He'd seen it happen before, but this time, he was the one sitting in the middle of it. Every morning he woke up early out of habit. Even though he wasn't working, his body still followed the same routine. He'd pour a cup of coffee, sit by the window, and watch the street outside. He used to enjoy those calm mornings before work, the quiet before the noise of the day began. But now the silence felt heavy, like a reminder that everything he built could vanish because of one wrong assumption. His phone rang less often now. In the first few days, he received calls from colleagues and friends, offering support and asking questions. But as the story grew, the calls faded. People didn't know what to say anymore. Some were afraid to be seen defending him. Others probably didn't believe in his innocence completely. That part hurt more than anything else, not knowing who still trusted him. His wife tried to keep him distracted. She cooked his favorite meals, talked about everyday things, and reminded him that this would pass. But even she could see how much the silence was changing him. He wasn't angry. He was just tired. One afternoon, he decided to visit the department, not to argue or plead his case, but to see if there was any update. When he walked in, the building felt different. People stopped talking when they saw him. Some nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. He'd once been the man they turned to for advice, but now, he was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. He walked straight to internal affairs. The detective handling his case greeted him respectfully. "We're close to finishing the report," the detective said. "It's looking more like a misunderstanding, but there are still procedures we have to follow." The captain nodded. "I understand. Just tell me one thing, did anyone even talk to the clerk again?" The detective hesitated. "Not yet, but it's planned for tomorrow." The captain took a slow breath. "Do that, please. He needs to know what really happened." "I don't blame him. He reacted the way anyone would. But I can't keep living like this, waiting for the world to think I'm a thief." The detective gave a small nod. "I'll make sure it's handled properly." On his way out, the captain passed by the briefing room. A group of younger officers were preparing for their shift. He could feel their eyes on him, full of curiosity and unease. He stopped at the doorway, hesitated, then turned and left quietly. Later that night, the younger officer who had arrested him called. "Sir," he said carefully, "I thought you should know there's been progress. The footage and the card records are now part of the main file. It looks like they'll clear you soon." The captain closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing through him. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to tell me that, but I appreciate it." "I just thought you should know," the officer said. "You deserve that much." The next few days felt lighter, but the tension in the city hadn't gone away. The media still talked about the case, using it as an example of how no one was above the law. The headlines were harsh. Some people online demanded that he resign, others defended him. The truth was still hidden under layers of noise. When the internal affairs report was finally completed, the detective called him in. The meeting room was small, just a table, 2 chairs, and a thick folder between them. The detective opened it slowly. "The evidence confirms that the payment never went through because of a technical failure," he said. "It also shows that you returned to the store almost immediately after stepping outside. The incident was clearly a misunderstanding." The captain didn't say anything for a long time. His throat felt dry. "So that's it?" he finally asked. The detective nodded. "Yes, you'll be cleared officially by the department tomorrow. The case will be closed." For a moment, the captain didn't know what to feel. He should have been relieved, but instead he felt strangely empty. It wasn't over yet. The truth would clear his name on paper, but not in people's minds. The next morning, he was called to the main hall for a short announcement. The chief stood in front of the department, his tone serious. "After a complete review of all evidence," he said, "we have concluded that the incident involving our captain was a misunderstanding caused by a payment error. He acted in good faith and no wrongdoing occurred." The words were clear and simple. Some officers clapped softly. Others just stood silently. The captain nodded politely, but inside, he still felt the sting of what had happened. He thanked the chief and walked out without saying much. Outside the station, the same reporters were waiting again. Cameras flashed, microphones were pushed toward him. "Do you have anything to say about being cleared?" Someone shouted. "Will you return to duty?" He paused for a moment before answering. "I've always believed in the system," he said quietly. "Even when it hurts. I hope this reminds people that justice can make mistakes, but it can also correct them." Then he walked away. At home, his wife met him at the door. She smiled, tears in her eyes. "You're free," she said softly. He nodded. "Yes, but it doesn't feel like it yet." She hugged him tightly, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to breathe. But freedom came with a new kind of burden. The media began spinning new stories. Some praising him for his patience, others questioning whether the department had covered for one of its own. People online debated endlessly. Truth was no longer just about facts. It was about what people wanted to believe. The captain spent the next few days avoiding the spotlight. He didn't go back to work right away. Instead, he visited his old mentor, a retired officer who had served before him. They sat on a park bench together, the way they used to when the captain was just starting his career. The older man listened quietly as the captain told him everything, from the arrest to the investigation to being cleared. When he finished, his mentor said, "You know, the hardest part of wearing that badge isn't enforcing the law. It's carrying the weight when the law forgets who you are, but you handled it with grace. That's what people will remember." The captain looked down at his hands. "I don't feel graceful. I just feel tired." The old man smiled gently. "That's part of it too. But don't let this make you bitter. You face the system the same way you taught others to, patiently, with faith." That's rare. Those words stayed with him. A week later, he returned to the department not as an accused man, but as a respected officer again. The building felt different now, but so did he. Some greeted him warmly. Others avoided his eyes, embarrassed perhaps by their silence during his ordeal. He didn't hold it against them. People were scared of getting involved. That was human nature. He walked into his office and saw his badge on the desk where he'd left it weeks ago. He picked it up slowly, running his fingers over the edges. It still shined, but it felt heavier somehow, as if carrying the memory of what had happened. Later that day, he gathered his team for a short meeting. They stood quietly, unsure what to expect. He looked around at them, some old faces, some new, all watching him closely. "I know the last few weeks have been strange," he began. "You probably saw things online, heard stories. I just want you to remember something. When you put on this uniform, you represent more than a department. You represent fairness. And fairness doesn't mean perfection. It means doing what's right even when it's hard. Those officers who arrested me, they did exactly that. And I respect them for it." The room was silent. A few nodded. One officer looked down, visibly moved. The captain smiled faintly. "We're human. We make mistakes. The goal isn't to avoid them, it's to fix them when they happen. That's how we keep this job honest." When the meeting ended, he stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the crisp air. The sun was setting again, just like the night it all began. But this time he felt a quiet peace inside him. He knew life would never be exactly the same. There would always be whispers, half-truths, and people who remembered the wrong version of the story. But he also knew something else. He'd survived it with dignity. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought in the streets or against criminals. They were fought inside the heart, between pride, pain, and the hope that truth still mattered. As he walked back inside, the captain glanced at the hallway wall where the department's motto was painted, "To protect and serve." For the first time in a long while, those words felt real again. The morning after the captain's arrest, the city police department felt heavier than usual. Conversations were quieter, faces more serious. People avoided eye contact in the hallways, as if saying nothing could undo what had happened. For many, the arrest had left a sour feeling. No one wanted to believe it, but the footage was there. The captain, out of uniform, being handcuffed by two officers outside a small store. The image had spread everywhere. The man who had led dozens of successful operations now looked like a suspect in front of flashing lights and curious strangers. At his home, the captain sat quietly in the living room. The curtains were drawn and the television was off. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from colleagues, messages from people asking questions he didn't have answers for. His wife moved silently around the house, making tea neither of them would drink. She tried to stay calm, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. Not just sadness, something deeper. Shame, confusion, disbelief. He spoke softly, more to himself than to her. "It was a mistake. I told them it was." She nodded, her hands trembling as she set the cup on the table. "I know, but everyone else doesn't." Meanwhile, at the department, the Internal Affairs Division had begun its work. Two senior investigators were assigned to review everything: the arrest video, witness statements, and the store's surveillance footage. The younger of the two, a patient man known for his fairness, watched the video several times. "Something doesn't feel right," he said finally. "He doesn't look like someone trying to steal." The other investigator looked up from the report. "But the store clerk says he didn't pay." "That's enough for the arresting officers." "Maybe," the younger man said quietly. "But sometimes what's seen isn't always what's true." The investigators requested the original surveillance recording from the store owner. When they arrived, the owner was visibly nervous. He had already been visited by reporters and didn't want more attention. "I told the officers everything," he said quickly. He took some items and walked out without paying. "I didn't know he was a police officer." "Can we see the full footage?" the younger investigator asked. The store owner hesitated but nodded. He led them to a small back room where the old security system sat on a dusty desk. He played the footage from the beginning, showing the captain entering the store, walking through the aisles and picking a few small items. Nothing unusual. Then came the moment that had caused all the trouble. The captain placed the items on the counter and pulled out his wallet. He tried to use his card, but the reader blinked red. He frowned, tried again, and then said something to the clerk. The clerk, busy with another customer, barely looked up. The captain waited, then patted his pockets as if searching for cash. Finally, he said something and headed toward the door. The owner paused the video. That's when I thought he was leaving without paying. Keep playing, the investigator said. The footage continued. The captain stepped outside, reached into his car through the window and seemed to take something out. At that exact moment, the two young officers pulled up, responding to the store owner's emergency call. They saw him at the car, thought he was escaping, and immediately confronted him. When the footage ended, the room went quiet. The younger investigator leaned back in his chair. He wasn't stealing. He was getting cash from his car. The clerk didn't give him a chance. The store owner rubbed his forehead. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just panicked. Back at the department, the investigators wrote their findings and sent them to the chief. The chief read every word carefully. He had worked with the captain for years and respected him deeply. The news hit him hard. He called for a private meeting with the investigation team. In that small meeting room, the chief asked only one question. Can we confirm this beyond doubt? Yes, sir, one of them replied. The footage is clear. The captain never intended to leave without paying. The system failed him, and so did the moment. The chief nodded slowly. Then we fix this. He released an internal statement first, making sure everyone in the department heard it from him before the media could twist it again. He said, Our captain was wrongfully accused due to a misunderstanding. The officers who made the arrest acted in good faith based on what they saw, but we now have proof that no crime occurred. Let this remind us that justice can make mistakes even within its own walls, but truth always finds its way. The next morning, the story spread again, this time with a different headline. Police captain cleared after investigation reveals mistaken arrest. The same public that had judged him too quickly now spoke in his defense. Some apologized. Some called it an example of fairness. Others said it showed the system worked even if imperfectly. For the captain, though, the damage was already done. Reputation once questioned never feels quite the same. He returned to the office after a few days, but the air felt strange. People greeted him with polite smiles, yet he could sense the awkwardness. A few colleagues looked embarrassed, others overly sympathetic. It wasn't anger he felt. It was exhaustion. Later that day, he met privately with the two officers who had arrested him. They stood nervously, unsure how to face him. The captain looked at them for a moment before speaking. You did your job, he said simply. You followed what you were trained to do. Don't ever feel sorry for that. One of the officers, clearly struggling, said, Sir, we didn't mean. I know, the captain interrupted gently. But this should teach all of us something. Sometimes, even when we follow the rules, we might still get it wrong. That's why we must always look twice at the facts and at the people. The words lingered in the room. For a moment, the officers didn't know how to respond. The captain gave them a small nod before walking out. That night, he sat again in his living room, but this time the silence felt different. His wife sat beside him, holding his hand. It's over, she whispered. Not really, he said quietly. But at least the truth is out, she smiled faintly. People will see your heart again. They always do. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The department worked to repair its image. The store owner publicly apologized, saying he had acted out of fear, not malice. The younger investigator received quiet praise from the chief for insisting on checking every detail. The two arresting officers continued their duty, now with a more careful eye and deeper respect for the power of their badge. As for the captain, he resumed his position, though he kept a lower profile. He avoided interviews, declined public comments, and focused instead on rebuilding trust, both his own and that of the system he served. He began holding short weekly meetings with his team, reminding them about the importance of empathy in policing. Justice isn't about catching wrongdoers, he told them once. It's about finding truth, and sometimes truth hides behind small misunderstandings. Those words stayed with everyone who heard them. They carried more weight because they came from someone who had lived through that truth himself. Months later, when a new batch of recruits joined the department, the training manual included a new section written by the captain. It talked about the importance of human judgment, the dangers of assumptions, and the courage to question even your own certainty. It didn't mention his name, but everyone knew who had written it, and though he never sought sympathy, the incident changed him deeply. He became more patient, more observant, and more forgiving, not just of others, but of himself. Because in the end, justice had made a mistake. But through that mistake, it found its humanity again. The morning after the captain's arrest, the city police department felt heavier than usual. Conversations were quieter, faces more serious. People avoided eye contact in the hallways as if saying nothing could undo what had happened. For many, the arrest had left a sour feeling. No one wanted to believe it, but the footage was there. The captain, out of uniform, being handcuffed by 2 officers outside a small store. The image had spread everywhere. The man who had led dozens of successful operations now looked like a suspect in front of flashing lights and curious strangers. At his home, the captain sat quietly in the living room. The curtains were drawn, and the television was off. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from colleagues, messages from people asking questions he didn't have answers for. His wife moved silently around the house, making tea neither of them would drink. She tried to stay calm, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. Not just sadness, something deeper. Shame, confusion, disbelief. He spoke softly, more to himself than to her. It was a mistake. I told them it was. She nodded, her hands trembling as she set the cup on the table. I know, but everyone else doesn't. Meanwhile, at the department, the Internal Affairs Division had begun its work. 2 senior investigators were assigned to review everything: the arrest video, witness statements, and the store's surveillance footage. The younger of the 2, a patient man known for his fairness, watched the video several times. Something doesn't feel right, he said finally. He doesn't look like someone trying to steal. The other investigator looked up from the report. But the store clerk says he didn't pay. That's enough for the arresting officers. Maybe, the younger man said quietly, but sometimes what's seen isn't always what's true. The investigators requested the original surveillance recording from the store owner. When they arrived, the owner was visibly nervous. He had already been visited by reporters and didn't want more attention. I told the officers everything, he said quickly. He took some items and walked out without paying. I didn't know he was a police officer. Can we see the full footage? The younger investigator asked. The store owner hesitated but nodded. He led them to a small back room where the old security system sat on a dusty desk. He played the footage from the beginning, showing the captain entering the store, walking through the aisles and picking a few small items. Nothing unusual. Then came the moment that had caused all the trouble. The captain placed the items on the counter and pulled out his wallet. He tried to use his card, but the reader blinked red. He frowned, tried again, and then said something to the clerk. The clerk, busy with another customer, barely looked up. The captain waited, then patted his pockets as if searching for cash. Finally, he said something and headed toward the door. The owner paused the video. That's when I thought he was leaving without paying. Keep playing, the investigator said. The footage continued. The captain stepped outside, reached into his car through the window, and seemed to take something out. At that exact moment, the 2 young officers pulled up, responding to the store owner's emergency call. They saw him at the car, thought he was escaping, and immediately confronted him. When the footage ended, the room went quiet. The younger investigator leaned back in his chair. He wasn't stealing. He was getting cash from his car. The clerk didn't give him a chance. The store owner rubbed his forehead. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just panicked. Back at the department, the investigators wrote their findings and sent them to the chief. The chief read every word carefully. He had worked with the captain for years and respected him deeply. The news hit him hard. He called for a private meeting with the investigation team. In that small meeting room, the chief asked only one question. Can we confirm this beyond doubt? Yes, sir, one of them replied. The footage is clear. The captain never intended to leave without paying. The system failed him, and so did the moment. The chief nodded slowly. Then we fix this.